Good evening, everybody. Marty Richards with Richland Center Tourism here, and we have the finale of the Why Do We Call It episode that we've done in three parts. The Why Do We Call It, the Mitchell House, and then also the trial of Rose Zodolsky. So tonight, you've kind of heard the prosecution's case against Rose, and now tonight you're going to hear the defense argument against the argument that the prosecution brought forward. Just remember, just a little bit of a refresher, our cast of characters. We have Rose Zodolsky, who was a resident of we learned was indeed a resident of the Ithaca area, and then moved to Richland Center. Not native to the area. We do know that she was not born in the area, but she was raised most of her life here. Then also Elly Maly, who was the unfortunate recipient of poisoning and death in their basically a rivalry or an accused rivalry over the affections of our other main character, Dr. George Mitchell. And then tonight, you're going to hear a lot. We introduced him yesterday, but Levi Bancroft, the defense attorney who defended primarily Rose. You're going to hear a lot about him and his actions tonight. So you might recall one of the first things that happened when Rose was charged, they hired Levi Bancroft to defend her, and he took this very serious and was really aggressive in his defense. The first thing he did was he filed for a change of venue, said that the jury pool had been poisoned in Richland County by the gossiping women of the county. His words, not mine. And so she could not get a fair trial, and then also filed for a change of judge, wanted a substitute judge. Both of those motions were approved, and the trial was moved to Grant County to Lancaster. And the trial for Rose Zodolsky would happen in Lancaster. So in Lancaster, it turned into a bit of a circus. Once she was held in jail, there were numerous flowers and just well wishes sent to her. There were requests for pictures of Rose from the Grant County residency. She became somewhat of a celebrity. And as this trial played out, this even got to the point where national newspapers were publicizing the latest that happened in the trial that day into their newspapers throughout the nation. So really the trial had become a spectacle. It appeared maybe some of this was the machinations and the work of Levi Bancroft, but they really wanted to win the trial in the court of public opinion, and they very much did so. So large numbers went and witnessed in the trial. Young fair Rose had become a bit of a celebrity. The trial goes on, and what happened was there's a bit of an argument and dispute because Rose will never testify in the trial, and this becomes a bit of a sticking point later for appeals, because what had also happened, Rose did have some relatives that were nearby, maybe not in the direct area, but had some cousins that had lived near in Wisconsin. They hired another attorney, a Mr. Chenoweth, to also assist in the defense. And because he was an elder statesman, had much more experience, he became the lead attorney, even though Levi Bancroft got to argue the case mostly. But Mr. Bancroft wanted Rose to testify in her own defense, and Mr. Chenoweth did not. And you'll find out later that becomes very important. So, the defense, or the argument against the points that I highlighted in our episode number 2 last night. Rose did say, and again, she didn't get to testify to this, but Mr. Bancroft had to argue this, that Dr. Lovering, you might remember, he claimed to have gotten a note from Rose that he was supposed to put in a good word for her with Dr. Mitchell as he was, looking for companionship and potentially a new wife following the death of his. He claimed that he had gotten a bit of a contract to say for money to put in a good word, and Rose claimed that that was a lie, that that never happened, and Dr. Lovering could not produce that note. So physical evidence didn't exist once again. The discussions that were used as testimony, Anna, the housekeeper, had quite a few statements that were incriminating of Rose, and Rose had said through Mr. Bancroft that those were in jest and that they regularly engaged in such prattle that wasn't true. Also, Mr. Bancroft alleged, and here's a direct quote, and I use my notes sometimes because there is a lot going on here, but this is an important quote, and remember, I didn't say this, he did. Quote, "The woman witnesses against Rose were vinegary old maids, and they pursued many untruths against her, including the unfounded gossip that she would become Mrs. George Mitchell within 6 months of the death of his wife." That did not come to pass. He tried to throw it off as gossip and tried to discount that argument in that way. He also, Levi Bancroft, also hammered away that all of the evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct physical evidence. She could not have poisoned Elly Maly through the use of the chocolates because the remaining chocolates that existed did not have poison in them. They were tested and were found to be free of any poison. He also suggested that Elly Maly had died of a, quote, fit, unquote. He also claimed that the Maly family was subject to regular fits of hysteria, and so that would have been the cause of her death, which I find to be an interesting argument that probably wouldn't hold very, very long in this day and age. But probably the most controversial and the one that was time-consuming, because the trial did continue for many months, and it was a long and drawn-out trial. Along the way, to combat the fact or to combat the idea that Rose had a hand in the death of Laura Mitchell, so remember this was brought up by the prosecuting attorneys, that not only had Rose perhaps poisoned Elly Maly, but had also poisoned Laura Mitchell, Dr. George Mitchell's wife. And to combat that, Mr. Bancroft had asked for, and ultimately it was granted, to have the former Mrs. Mitchell's body exhumed and tested in Chicago for strychnine poisoning, which was the alleged poison that was used. This was done. They actually halted the trial, exhumed her body, was taken to Chicago for testing, to the Rush Medical College. A Professor Haynes testified then, after the delay, that trace amounts of strychnine were found in Laura Mitchell's body. However, under cross-examination now, Dr. Mitchell admitted that when his wife was ill, he had treated her with something, a potion called Nux Vomica, and also another potion, Belladonna, was used to treat her. Be thankful we are in today's medical age. I really am concerned about some of the methods in the past. And the reason being is that those two items also contained strychnine. So there would have been strychnine in her body from the treatment that Dr. Mitchell, and it was customary at that time to use those. So after all of those arguments, the case goes to the jury. Remember, the jury is made up basically of Grant County farmers. None of these folks really are learned individuals other than agriculture. They were all farmers, all male. They went out and deliberated for 22 hours. For 22 hours, they held deliberations. It was a split vote many times, and then all of a sudden, late into the 22nd hour, they took another vote after considerable pressure was brought by the foreman, and some votes were swayed, and ultimately, they did return a verdict of guilty of murder, first-degree murder, and Rose was then sentenced to 99 years in the state prison in Waupun. She then was directly taken to Waupun to serve her sentence. The word was she kept to herself. She was very isolated, although honestly at that point in time we don't know, but there probably were not very many female prisoners at that point either. So it would have been very customary that she would have been somewhat isolated from the general population. Immediately, Levi Bancroft, remember this encompassed 6 years of his life as an attorney, he began the appeals process. And one of the things in his appeals process that he kept saying was that Rose was not able to testify in her own defense due to undue pressure from the other attorney in the case, because he wanted her to testify, because they learned in interviews afterwards that all of the farmers that were on the jury considered that her not testifying was an indication that she was indeed guilty. And so Attorney Bennett Attorney Bancroft really fought for that. All appeals were exhausted. It ended up going to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, and they, in their final judgment, said, hey, she received a very fair trial, really vigorous defense, and so they felt it was a fair trial. There was no need for a retrial. So then immediately, Levi Bancroft starts to appeal to governors for clemency. The first appeal was in 1894 to Governor George Peck, and he refused to grant her clemency. And then a second time in 1897, on the last day of his term, Governor W.H. Upham pardoned Rose on his last day in office. The judge who had presided over the trial in Grant County, Judge George Clementson, was appalled and upset. He stated, he was very outraged and stated that it was a perversion of justice that she received clemency, that he was completely convinced by the end of the trial that she had indeed committed the trial. So in 1897 then, Rose was released, and she immediately went to Oklahoma where her father was. There is no word of what Rose did after that. In the next census that would have occurred after that, her name disappeared, so it's assumed that she married at that point, and then the rest of her life lived out a quiet life, because there was no record of any other news accounts following that with her name. Dr. Mitchell, a couple of things with Dr. Mitchell. It was real interesting because he did marry shortly after the death of Elly Maly, only a couple years after she had passed away, and then really 2 years after his own wife had passed away. A little bit of a twist in this story. Dr. Mitchell, married Minnie German, and that name's going to sound a little familiar because this happens to be A.D. German's sister. And you might recall on our first episode that we saw the A.D. German warehouse right across the street from Dr. Mitchell's office. Also, Dr. Mitchell sold the hotel that was previously sitting on the site that he owned and ran in the mid-1890s to none other than A.D. German. So there was a very interesting relationship that existed between Dr. Mitchell, A.D. German, and then ultimately Minnie German. Now, a little side note to that, when he married Minnie German, the family did not approve of that. It was it was not a welcomed marriage, and it sounds like there was quite a bit of friction there. One bit of note, and I found this amazing as well. When Dr. Mitchell and Minnie German married, they did have children. And one of their sons was George W. Mitchell. He ended up becoming a very important individual on the board of the Federal Reserve. He was on the board of governors. Federal Reserve ended up becoming the second highest as the vice president of our Federal Reserve. And so if you look, you'll see there are dollar bills circulating with his name actually on them. Born in Richland Center, and then ultimately Dr. Mitchell and his wife Minnie ended up moving to Madison shortly after. I believe it was 1917 that they then moved to Madison for a quieter areas and surroundings. So that is the long story, the